In breaking news out of Europe, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has died. Russian media reports have announced his death in the last hour.
Mr. Gorbachev is credited with ending the Cold War without bloodshed, but he failed to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union shortly afterwards. Let's bring in now Carrington Clarke in our Washington bureau on that breaking news that Mikhail Gorbachev has died at the age of 91. Carrington, good morning. What do we know?
Well, the details are still hazy. We're waiting for full confirmation, but this is one of the most significant figures of really the late 20th century. He left a tarnished legacy at home, it should be could be argued. I mean, he was very much welcomed by the West as the man who saw the peaceful end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. But many people, including Vladimir Putin, obviously believe that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he's been active in trying to rebuild that Soviet Union, including in current events in Ukraine. But he was lauded by the West in particular. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, and really was somebody embraced by Western leaders as somebody both who they could do business with while he still had the reins of power, and then in his post-political career did a great deal of touring, including pushing environmental causes. But this is a significant life that now has ended, and it will be interesting to see exactly how his legacy is embraced, both in Russia but also in the West. Here in the United States, President Biden is currently close to home here in Washington, D.C. We're waiting to see exactly what he has to say. He knew Mikhail Gorbachev personally. He obviously had a very long career in the Senate before he became vice president and now president, including a very influential role in foreign policy. So we do expect that the president will remark on this significant passing. But really, it I think is the juxtaposition of the death of the man who oversaw the end of the Soviet Union versus what we're seeing today with Vladimir Putin's active efforts to regain territory that he believes has been lost to the Russian Empire, is really something to significant and to take pause on. But a very significant life that has ended, and something we wait to see what the ramifications and what the response is both in Russia and abroad. The responses will be far-ranging and widespread, I'm sure. A very interesting point you made there about the juxtaposition, so correct. But really going back to what Mikhail Gorbachev did, working with Ronald Reagan to pretty much end the Cold War, it was such a promising moment, wasn't it, for the world after decades of Cold War, after decades of all of us at the time living under the threat of nuclear annihilation? Yeah, I mean, there were grandiose statements about this being the end of history. Remember that this was it, that this was the culmination of the peace plan in the post-World War II environment, and finally the great nations of the world could come together. That isn't how it's played out. And many would argue that the treatment of Russia in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union maybe laid some of the seeds of what we've seen now germinating today. But it was a time of great upheaval in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet republics. There was a great deal of promise, but many of those promises weren't kept, as we saw the oligarchs move in and great deals of national wealth being effectively stolen from people. And those ripples have been felt throughout the decades since. Mikhail Gorbachev had an interesting post-leadership role. He obviously lost to power effectively to Boris Yeltsin in the aftermath. He became a president without a country with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then he did work as kind of a roaming ambassador around the world, pushing the issues of peace. But he never sat comfortably with the Putin regime. And he never really came in direct conflict with Putin, understanding, I guess, exactly what normally happens to Putin's major critics at home. But it never sat well with the current image of Russia that Vladimir Putin was trying to push versus what we'd heard repeatedly from Gorbachev in regards to that openness and the willingness to embrace the West and embrace the rest of the world, and that the countries could work side by side. So in many ways, his legacy, I say, is complicated. It is tarnished at home, but he was still a very significant character on the world stage, and was embraced by many people as being somebody who did bring about, at least for a brief period, peace between countries that really had been at loggerheads for a significant amount of time.
Carrington, thanks for staying on the line. Mikhail Gorbachev was indeed a huge figure in the late 20th century.
Yeah, a huge figure. At the height of the Soviet Union, well, really even in the 1980s, it was hard to imagine the Soviet Union coming to an end, first of all, but also coming to an end in such a peaceful way, as it were, without bloodshed, as you point out. He, first of all, withdrew the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. That was a significant move in itself. And then embracing these ideas of glasnost and perestroika, the idea of reforming the Soviet Union and also openness to outside forces. Now, arguably, that set the Soviet Union on a path that eventually then led to its almost inevitable destruction. But it was one that meant that for a time at least, the potential for nuclear war within the world was lessened. And that was a significant movement. We had these two global superpowers who were at loggerheads, and he managed to negotiate a settlement where that threat of a nuclear holocaust was at least lessened for a period. Now, unfortunately, his rule did mean the fall of the Soviet Union happened still in a fairly ramshackle fashion and did lead to huge economic dislocation. Now, many would argue he wasn't the person who eventually had the reins of power. Boris Yeltsin took over as the president of Russia as the Soviet republics went their independent ways, and arguably that was the reason why we saw the economic downfall of the former republics. But it didn't live up to the promise that many people were hoping at the time when he was offering this new path for the Soviet Union. He then managed this political leadership role as a kind of roving ambassador around the world. He was embraced, particularly here in the United States where I am, as somebody that they could first work with as a leader, but then in his post-political role as somebody who embraced things like freedom and the need for people to have a say in their own destinies. But he was not embraced by the man who eventually took on political power in Russia, Vladimir Putin, who has called the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and has very clearly indicated that he wants to regain the power that the Soviet Union had at its height. And obviously we see the effects of that today in Ukraine, but also in his actions with the relationship with Belarus and some of the incursions to places like Georgia. But this is a significant death. We are expecting to hear a great deal of tributes, particularly here in Washington, D.C. He was a significant figure for many people in Washington, and it will be interesting to see how his reputation will be supported by, I expect, people here in Washington, D.C., and whether or not we see a more muted response from the Kremlin and from Russia regarding his role, because it is complicated, and both among the ruling political class, but also among the general population, who do see, for many people, now look back at the Soviet Union perhaps with rose-coloured glasses about a country where they had global influence, and obviously at the moment, with the sanctions that have been imposed on them because of their invasion of Ukraine, probably look back at that period with some nostalgia. But a significant death and something that I'm sure his reputation will now be worked through by many experts to kind of figure out exactly what Gorbachev meant to global affairs.
Carrington Clarke in Washington, thank you very much.